After driving 600 miles to be with my family, I walked in and heard, "Do we really have to feed her?" The highway stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the heart of America. Mile marker after mile marker blurred past my windshield as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white from the tension I couldn't quite shake. 600 miles. That's how far I'd driven from my little apartment in Denver to get back to the place I used to call home. For years. It had been 4 long years since I'd set foot in Millbrook, the small town where I grew up, where my memories were carved into every street corner and my ghost still whispered in familiar places. For years since I'd packed everything I owned into 2 suitcases and left without looking back, promising myself I'd never return to the people who made me feel like I was never quite enough. But then Marcus called. My older brother's voice had crackled through my phone 3 weeks ago, catching me off guard as I was closing up the small bookstore where I worked. "Sarah," he'd said, and just hearing my name in his voice made my chest tighten. "We're doing a big family reunion. Mom would have wanted us all together. You have to come."
Mom.
The mention of her name was like a key turning in a lock I'd kept firmly shut. She'd been gone for 2 years now, and I hadn't even made it to the funeral. Not because I didn't want to be there, but because when I called to ask about the arrangements, Candace, Marcus's wife, had been the one to answer. Her voice had been ice cold as she told me the service was just for immediate family. The sting of those words still burned. "Please, Sarah," Marcus had continued, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "I know things got complicated before you left, but we're family. We need to be together, especially now. Candace is cooking Mom's famous pot roast recipe. Remember how you used to help her make it every Sunday?" I did remember. I remembered standing on a step stool next to Mom's kitchen counter, my small hands dusted with flour as she taught me to roll dumplings. I remembered the way the whole house smelled like rosemary and love on Sunday afternoons. I remembered feeling like I belonged somewhere. So despite every rational thought in my head screaming at me to decline, despite the 4 years of silence and hurt feelings, I'd said yes. Because somewhere deep in my chest, a tiny flame of hope still flickered. Maybe things could be different now. Maybe time had softened the edges of old wounds. Maybe family really was worth trying for. The drive had given me plenty of time to think, perhaps too much time. As the miles rolled by, my mind kept wandering back to that winter night 3 years ago when everything changed between Marcus and me. It was the kind of bitter cold that cut through your coat and settled in your bones. I was in my tiny apartment, finally feeling like I was getting my life together after years of struggling, when I heard the knock on my door. Marcus stood there in the hallway, looking like a broken man. His shoulders were slumped, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and his eyes, God, his eyes looked so desperate. He couldn't even meet my gaze as he asked if he could come in. "The bank," he'd whispered once we were sitting on my second-hand couch, his head in his hands. "They're going to foreclose on the business. Everything I've worked for, Sarah. The garage, the house, Candace's car. They're going to take it all. I don't know what to do." Marcus had always been the golden child, the one who seemed to have everything figured out. While I was struggling through community college and working 3 part-time jobs just to pay rent, he was running his own auto repair shop and living in the house our grandparents had left us. The house that, according to the will, was supposed to be split between us, though somehow it had ended up entirely in his name on the deed. Paperwork mix-up, he'd explained years ago, and I'd been too young and trusting to question it. But that night, seeing him so broken, none of the old resentments mattered. He was my brother, and he needed help. "How much?" I'd asked, already reaching for my checkbook. $32,000, he'd whispered. "Sarah, I know it's a lot. I know you don't have that kind of money just lying around. But if I don't pay them by Friday, I lose everything. And I can't ask Mom and Dad. You know how Dad feels about me borrowing money." $32,000. It was every penny I'd saved over 3 years of living like a monk, every dollar I'd scraped together from my bookstore job and weekend tutoring gigs. It was my emergency fund, my security blanket, my ticket to a better future. It was supposed to be the down payment on my own little place, my first real step toward independence. But looking at Marcus that night, seeing the shame and fear written across his face, I didn't hesitate. I wrote him a check that would empty my savings account completely, because that's what you do for family. That's what love looks like sometimes. Sacrificing your own dreams so someone else can keep theirs alive. "I'll pay you back," he'd promised, gripping my hands as tears rolled down his cheeks. "Every penny, Sarah. With interest. I swear to you I'll make this right." He'd also asked me not to tell anyone about the loan. "It would make me look weak," he'd explained. "You know how Candace gets about money, and if Dad found out I had to borrow from my little sister..." He'd trailed off, but I understood. Marcus had always been proud, sometimes to a fault. So I'd kept his secret, even when months passed, and he never mentioned paying me back. Even when I had to move to a smaller, cheaper apartment because I couldn't afford my rent anymore. Even when I had to take a second job just to buy groceries. I told myself he was probably still getting back on his feet, that he'd reach out when he could. But he never did. Instead, I started seeing pictures on social media of family gatherings I wasn't invited to. Photos of Marcus and Candace at expensive restaurants, vacation pictures from their trip to Hawaii, posts about the new truck he'd bought for the business. All funded, I realized, by the sacrifice I'd made and the secret I'd kept. The hurt built up slowly, like water behind a dam. Every ignored text, every missed birthday, every family event where I wasn't even considered, it all piled up until one day I couldn't take it anymore. I left Millbrook with 2 suitcases and a promise to myself that I'd never let anyone make me feel invisible again. But now, as I took the exit that led to my hometown, I wondered if I'd been too harsh. Maybe Marcus had tried to reach out and I'd missed it. Maybe pride had kept him from addressing the money issue. Maybe Candace had changed. Maybe I was the one who'd been holding on to old hurts. The familiar landmarks came into view. The water tower with Millbrook Hornets, painted in faded blue letters, the old diner where we used to get milkshakes after school, the Methodist church where I'd sung in the choir every Sunday until I was 16. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, more worn around the edges, but still achingly familiar. As I turned onto Maple Street, my heart began to race. There it was, the house where I'd grown up. The 2-story colonial with the wraparound porch and the ancient oak tree in the front yard. The tree where Marcus had hung a tire swing for me when I was 7. The porch where Mom used to sit and wave goodbye when I left for school. It looked exactly the same, except for the new cars in the driveway, a shiny red SUV that must be Candace's, and a black pickup truck that was definitely Marcus's style. I parked behind them, my hands shaking slightly as I turned off the engine. This was it. After 4 years of silence, of hurt feelings and missed opportunities, of carrying the weight of that secret loan and the sting of being forgotten, I was home. The laughter spilling from the kitchen window reached my ears, warm and inviting, and for a moment, that tiny flame of hope flared brighter. Maybe Marcus had learned to appreciate what family really meant. Maybe Candace had realized that blood runs thicker than pride. Maybe this reunion would be the fresh start we all needed. I grabbed my overnight bag from the back seat, took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air, and walked toward the front door. Toward family. Toward hope. Toward a truth that would shatter everything I thought I knew about the people I'd sacrificed everything for. The front door was unlocked, just as it had always been when we were kids. Some things never change in small towns, I thought, allowing myself a small smile as I turned the familiar brass handle. The entryway still smelled like Mom's lavender potpourri, though it was fainter now, mixed with something else. Candace's expensive perfume, maybe, or some new air freshener that didn't quite belong. I could hear voices coming from the kitchen, warm and animated, the kind of family chatter I dreamed about during those lonely nights in Denver. Multiple conversations layering over each other, punctuated by bursts of genuine laughter. My heart lifted despite my nerves. This was what I'd driven 600 miles for, this sense of belonging, of being part of something bigger than myself. "I can't believe you actually made Mom's apple pie from scratch," a voice I didn't recognize was saying. Must be one of the cousins I hadn't seen in years. "Well, someone had to carry on the tradition," came Candace's reply, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Though I had to call Aunt Betty 3 times to get the measurements right. "You know how Mom never wrote anything down?" I paused in the hallway, suddenly uncertain. Should I announce myself, or just walk in? The old me would have bounded into the kitchen without a second thought, but 4 years of absence had made me a stranger in my own childhood home. I felt like I needed permission to enter spaces that used to be mine. The floorboard under my feet creaked, the same loose board that had always given away midnight snack raids when Marcus and I were teenagers. I froze, but the conversation in the kitchen continued uninterrupted. "Did you get enough food, though?" another voice asked. "I saw Robert's truck outside, and you know how that man can eat." "Oh, we'll be fine." Candace laughed, and there was something sharp in her tone that made my stomach clench. "I made plenty for everyone who actually matters." "What about Sarah?" The unfamiliar voice again. Marcus said she was driving down from Colorado. The silence that followed was deafening. It stretched on for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear over the sudden pounding of my heart. "Do we really have to feed her?" Candace's voice, when it finally came, was dripping with disdain. "She's been gone for years. She can buy her own meal." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually stumbled backward, my shoulder bumping against the wall. The overnight bag slipped from my suddenly numb fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a soft thud. "I mean, really," Candace continued, her voice gaining momentum now, as if the cruelty was feeding on itself. "She shows up after 4 years of radio silence, acting like nothing happened. Like she didn't just abandon the family when things got tough. Mom was heartbroken when she left, you know. Absolutely heartbroken." "Candace." Someone started to interrupt, but she was on a roll now. "No, I'm serious. She missed Mom's funeral, her own mother's funeral, and now she expects us to welcome her back with open arms? To set a place at the table, like she's been here all along? Some people have a lot of nerve." I pressed my back against the wall, my legs suddenly shaky. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't the reunion Marcus had promised me, the fresh start I'd dared to hope for. The laughter I'd heard from outside hadn't been warm family bonding. It had been them, laughing about me, planning how to handle the unwanted sister who'd driven 600 miles for nothing. "She probably doesn't even remember how to act around normal people," Candace went on, and I could picture her gesturing with that dismissive little wave she always did when she was being particularly catty. "Living alone in some big city, thinking she's better than us small-town folks. Well, she made her choice. She doesn't get to just waltz back in and expect special treatment." My chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing my lungs. All those hours on the road, all those memories I'd let myself revisit, all that hope I'd carefully cultivated, it was crumbling around me like a house of cards in a windstorm. But what hurt most wasn't Candace's words, cruel as they were. It was the silence from everyone else. Where was Marcus? Where was his voice, defending his sister, reminding his wife that family meant something? Where were the cousins, the aunts, the uncles who used to ruffle my hair and sneak me extra cookies? The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of dishes clinking and what sounded like someone opening the oven door. They were just going to let her words hang there, unchallenged. In their silence, they were agreeing with her. I took a shaky step forward, then another. I couldn't hide in the hallway forever. Better to face this head-on, to walk into that kitchen with whatever dignity I had left and show them that their words couldn't destroy me. But as I reached the kitchen doorway, the conversation started up again, lighter now, as if the topic of my worthiness had been settled and dismissed. "These rolls turned out perfect," someone was saying. "Candace, you outdid yourself," came another compliment. I stepped into the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room fell silent instantly, 10 pairs of eyes turning toward me like spotlights. Faces I recognized but hadn't seen in years suddenly looked unfamiliar, uncertain. And there was Candace, standing by the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand, her face cycling through a rapid succession of emotions, surprise, embarrassment, guilt, and finally landing on that fake, sugary smile she'd perfected over the years. "Sarah," she exclaimed, her voice pitched just a little too high, a little too bright. "You made it. We were just talking about you. I'll bet you were, I thought, but I managed to keep my expression neutral. Years of customer service work had taught me how to smile when I wanted to scream. "Hello, Candace," I said quietly, setting my bag down by the door. Everyone. The awkwardness in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. People shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in their drinks or the pattern on the tablecloth. Marcus was nowhere to be seen. "We're so glad you could make it," Candace continued, that horrible smile never wavering. "It's been far too long." Far too long, indeed. And in that moment, looking at the faces of people who were supposed to be my family, I realized it might have been far too long for a reason. "Sarah?" Marcus's voice boomed from behind me, and I turned to see my brother entering the kitchen through the back door, wiping grease from his hands with an old rag. He looked older than I remembered. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 4 years ago, and his hair was thinning at the crown. But his smile seemed genuine as he approached me. For a moment, I felt that familiar surge of sibling affection. This was Marcus, the brother who used to sneak me ice cream when I was grounded, who taught me how to drive in the empty Walmart parking lot, who cried when I scraped my knee falling off my bike. "You actually made it," he said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like motor oil and aftershave. "I wasn't sure you'd really come." "I said I would," I replied, trying to inject some warmth into my voice despite the ice in my chest from what I'd just overheard. "Well, come on then, let's get you fed," he said, releasing me and turning toward the dining room. "Candace has been cooking all day. Wait until you taste her pot roast." The dining room table was set for what looked like 12 people, with Mom's good china and the cloth napkins she only used for special occasions. The sight of those familiar place settings made my throat tight. How many Sunday dinners had we shared around this table? How many birthdays, holidays, ordinary Tuesday nights when Dad decided we needed to eat like civilized people instead of animals? But as everyone began filing in from the kitchen, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Every seat had a place setting except one. The chair at the far end of the table, the one that used to be mine when I was little, sat conspicuously bare. "Oh," Candace said, following my gaze, her hand flying to her throat in a gesture of perfectly performed surprise. "I must have miscounted. Let me grab another setting." She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me standing awkwardly by the empty chair while everyone else found their seats. The conversations resumed around me, discussions about work, kids, the weather, but I felt like I was watching it all from behind glass. Candace returned with a single plate, fork, and knife, setting them down with more force than necessary. No napkin, no glass, no salad fork like everyone else had. "There we go," she said brightly. "All set." I sat down in silence, watching as she began serving from the kitchen. Heaping portions of golden brown pot roast appeared on plates around the table, accompanied by roasted potatoes that gleamed with butter, green beans that looked like they belonged in a magazine, and rolls so perfectly golden they could have been painted. Uncle Robert got a mountain of food. Cousin Jennifer's plate was piled high with seconds before she'd even finished her firsts. Even little Tommy, Marcus's neighbor's kid, who couldn't have been more than 8, received a generous portion. And then Candace reached me. She paused, serving spoon hovering over the pot roast, her eyes meeting mine for just a moment. In that look, I saw everything. The resentment, the territorial hostility, the cold calculation of someone who decided I didn't deserve basic human courtesy. The spoon moved to the next person without stopping. I sat there, staring at my empty plate, as the woman who'd married into my family served everyone around me. The conversations continued, but they felt muffled now, like I was underwater. Someone laughed at a joke I hadn't heard. Forks clinked against china. Ice cubes rattled in glasses I didn't have. "Sarah, could you pass the salt?" Aunt Linda asked from across the table. I reached for the salt shaker, grateful to have something to do, but realized it was just out of my reach. I had to half stand to grab it, stretching awkwardly over my empty space while everyone else settled comfortably into their feast. "Thanks, honey," Linda said, then turned back to her conversation with Marcus about his business. I poured myself a glass of water from the pitcher, my movements feeling mechanical, disconnected. The water tasted like nothing. Everything tasted like nothing. "So, Sarah," Jennifer said suddenly, and I looked up hopefully. Finally, someone was acknowledging my presence. "What have you been up to? Still working at that bookstore?" "Yes," I replied, grateful for the opening. "Actually, I was promoted to assistant manager last year. We're expanding into." "That's nice," she said, but her attention had already shifted back to her plate. The conversation moved on without me, flowing around my words like water around a stone. I sat there, forgotten again, watching my family enjoy a meal that had been prepared with me specifically excluded. Marcus, the brother I'd saved from financial ruin, was deep in conversation with his father-in-law about football scores. He hadn't looked at me once since we'd sat down. The empty space in front of me felt enormous, a void that seemed to grow larger with each passing minute. I reached for the basket of rolls in the center of the table, taking one and breaking it into small pieces just to have something to do with my hands. "Those are for people who are actually eating dinner," Candace said sweetly, her voice carrying just far enough for me to hear, but not far enough to interrupt the other conversations. I set the roll down, my face burning with humiliation. This was my family. These were the people I'd driven 600 miles to see, the ones I'd held on to hope for despite years of silence. And they were treating me like an uninvited stranger who'd wandered in off the street. But the worst part wasn't the empty plate or the missing glass or even Candace's passive-aggressive cruelty. The worst part was Marcus, sitting there in comfortable ignorance, enjoying a meal funded by money I'd never see again, surrounded by the family he'd chosen over the sister who'd sacrificed everything for him. As I sat there, invisible at my own family's table, I made a decision. I was done being the forgotten sister, the convenient source of emergency funds, the family member who could be discarded when she was no longer useful. It was time they remembered exactly who they'd been taking for granted. "Sarah?" Marcus's voice boomed from behind me, and I turned to see my brother entering the kitchen through the back door, wiping grease from his hands with an old rag. He looked older than I remembered. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 4 years ago, and his hair was thinning at the crown. But his smile seemed genuine as he approached me. For a moment, I felt that familiar surge of sibling affection. This was Marcus, the brother who used to sneak me ice cream when I was grounded, who taught me how to drive in the empty Walmart parking lot, who cried when I scraped my knee falling off my bike. "You actually made it," he said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like motor oil and aftershave. "I wasn't sure you'd really come." "I said I would," I replied, trying to inject some warmth into my voice despite the ice in my chest from what I'd just overheard. "Well, come on then, let's get you fed," he said, releasing me and turning toward the dining room. "Candace has been cooking all day. Wait until you taste her pot roast." The dining room table was set for what looked like 12 people, with Mom's good china and the cloth napkins she only used for special occasions. The sight of those familiar place settings made my throat tight. How many Sunday dinners had we shared around this table? How many birthdays, holidays, ordinary Tuesday nights when Dad decided we needed to eat like civilized people instead of animals? But as everyone began filing in from the kitchen, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Every seat had a place setting except one. The chair at the far end of the table, the one that used to be mine when I was little, sat conspicuously bare. "Oh," Candace said, following my gaze, her hand flying to her throat in a gesture of perfectly performed surprise. "I must have miscounted. Let me grab another setting." She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me standing awkwardly by the empty chair while everyone else found their seats. The conversations resumed around me, discussions about work, kids, the weather, but I felt like I was watching it all from behind glass. Candace returned with a single plate, fork, and knife, setting them down with more force than necessary. No napkin, no glass, no salad fork like everyone else had. "There we go," she said brightly. "All set." I sat down in silence, watching as she began serving from the kitchen. Heaping portions of golden brown pot roast appeared on plates around the table, accompanied by roasted potatoes that gleamed with butter, green beans that looked like they belonged in a magazine, and rolls so perfectly golden they could have been painted. Uncle Robert got a mountain of food. Cousin Jennifer's plate was piled high with seconds before she'd even finished her firsts. Even little Tommy, Marcus's neighbor's kid, who couldn't have been more than 8, received a generous portion. And then Candace reached me. She paused, serving spoon hovering over the pot roast, her eyes meeting mine for just a moment. In that look, I saw everything. The resentment, the territorial hostility, the cold calculation of someone who decided I didn't deserve basic human courtesy. The spoon moved to the next person without stopping. I sat there, staring at my empty plate, as the woman who'd married into my family served everyone around me. The conversations continued, but they felt muffled now, like I was underwater. Someone laughed at a joke I hadn't heard. Forks clinked against china. Ice cubes rattled in glasses I didn't have. "Sarah, could you pass the salt?" Aunt Linda asked from across the table. I reached for the salt shaker, grateful to have something to do, but realized it was just out of my reach. I had to half stand to grab it, stretching awkwardly over my empty space while everyone else settled comfortably into their feast. "Thanks, honey," Linda said, then turned back to her conversation with Marcus about his business. I poured myself a glass of water from the pitcher, my movements feeling mechanical, disconnected. The water tasted like nothing. Everything tasted like nothing. "So, Sarah," Jennifer said suddenly, and I looked up hopefully. Finally, someone was acknowledging my presence. "What have you been up to? Still working at that bookstore?" "Yes," I replied, grateful for the opening. "Actually, I was promoted to assistant manager last year. We're expanding into." "That's nice," she said, but her attention had already shifted back to her plate. The conversation moved on without me, flowing around my words like water around a stone. I sat there, forgotten again, watching my family enjoy a meal that had been prepared with me specifically excluded. Marcus, the brother I'd saved from financial ruin, was deep in conversation with his father-in-law about football scores. He hadn't looked at me once since we'd sat down. The empty space in front of me felt enormous, a void that seemed to grow larger with each passing minute. I reached for the basket of rolls in the center of the table, taking one and breaking it into small pieces just to have something to do with my hands. "Those are for people who are actually eating dinner," Candace said sweetly, her voice carrying just far enough for me to hear, but not far enough to interrupt the other conversations. I set the roll down, my face burning with humiliation. This was my family. These were the people I'd driven 600 miles to see, the ones I'd held on to hope for despite years of silence. And they were treating me like an uninvited stranger who'd wandered in off the street. But the worst part wasn't the empty plate or the missing glass or even Candace's passive-aggressive cruelty. The worst part was Marcus, sitting there in comfortable ignorance, enjoying a meal funded by money I'd never see again, surrounded by the family he'd chosen over the sister who'd sacrificed everything for him. As I sat there, invisible at my own family's table, I made a decision. I was done being the forgotten sister, the convenient source of emergency funds, the family member who could be discarded when she was no longer useful. It was time they remembered exactly who they'd been taking for granted. Dinner dragged on for what felt like hours, though the clock on the mantel showed it had only been 45 minutes since we'd sat down. The conversations flowed around me like I was invisible. Talk of kids' soccer games, vacation plans, local gossip about people I'd once known but who felt like strangers now. I sat there, still staring at my empty plate, listening to the sound of my family's contentment while my own stomach quietly growled. Finally, mercifully, people began pushing back from the table. Aunt Linda started collecting plates, Uncle Robert loosened his belt with a satisfied groan, and the cousins migrated toward the living room where I could hear someone turning on the television. I stood up slowly, my legs stiff from sitting in that uncomfortable silence, and followed the others into the living room. The space looked exactly the same as it had when I was a child, Mom's old floral couch, Dad's recliner that no one else was allowed to sit in, the family photos covering every surface. Except now the photos stopped abruptly about 4 years ago. There were pictures of Marcus and Candace's anniversary party, their vacation to Niagara Falls, Christmas mornings I'd missed. But no pictures of me. It was like I'd been carefully edited out of the family story. I walked over to the mantelpiece, running my fingers along the familiar wood grain. There were new additions since I'd been gone, a photo of Marcus receiving some kind of business award, another of him and Candace at what looked like a charity gala. Both recent, both expensive-looking events. The kind of events you attend when business is booming and money is no longer a worry. That was last month, Candace said, appearing beside me and pointing to the charity gala photo. The Chamber of Commerce fundraiser. Marcus was one of the major sponsors this year. Major sponsor. I almost laughed at the irony. Marcus, who 3 years ago couldn't make his loan payments, was now wealthy enough to sponsor charity events. And standing right next to me was the woman who'd refused to put food on my plate, talking about her husband's generosity, like it was something to be proud of. How wonderful, I said, my voice perfectly level. It's amazing how things can turn around. The living room had filled with family members, all settling in with their full bellies and comfortable assumptions. Marcus was in Dad's old chair, remote control in hand, flipping through channels. Several cousins were sprawled on the floor, kids running around between the adults' legs. It was the picture of domestic bliss, the kind of scene Norman Rockwell might have painted. I picked up the wine glass someone had abandoned on the coffee table. Might as well have something to hold, since I hadn't been offered anything else all evening. The wine was good, probably expensive. Everything in this house seemed expensive now. I've been thinking about this place, I said suddenly, my voice carrying clearly across the room. The chatter died down. Marcus looked up from the television, his finger pausing on the remote. Candace, who had been straightening pillows on the couch, froze mid-motion. What do you mean? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. I took a sip of the wine, letting the silence stretch out. In the quiet, I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, the same clock that had marked time throughout my childhood. How many hours had I spent in this room, dreaming about my future, planning the life I wanted to build? How many of those dreams had I sacrificed for the people now staring at me with wary expressions? Well, I said, walking slowly around the room, letting my gaze drift over the family photos, the expensive furniture, the signs of prosperity that surrounded us. I've been living in Colorado for 4 years now. Denver's expensive, you know. Really expensive. And I've been thinking it might be time to make some changes. Changes? Marcus had set down the remote now, giving me his full attention for the first time all evening. I paused in front of another photo, this one of Marcus cutting the ribbon at some business event, local leaders flanking him, everyone smiling for the camera. I've been renting this tiny apartment, working 2 jobs just to make ends meet. Do you know what it's like, living paycheck to paycheck? Never being able to save anything, never being able to plan for the future. The room was completely silent now. Even the kids had stopped running around, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Of course, some people might say that's my own fault. I continued, my voice still conversational, almost musing. Some people might say I made poor financial decisions, that I should have been more careful with my money, more responsible. Candace's eyes were darting between Marcus and me, confusion creeping across her features. She clearly didn't understand what was happening, but she could sense the danger in it. But the thing is, I said, turning to face Marcus directly, I used to have savings. I used to have a nest egg, a safety net. I used to have plans for my future, dreams I was working toward. Marcus had gone very still in Dad's chair. His face was pale, and I could see his hands gripping the armrests. I think it's time I make a decision about this house, I said, gesturing around the room with my wine glass. Since it's in my name and all. The effect was immediate and devastating. Candace's face went white, then red, then white again. She whirled toward Marcus, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. What is she talking about? She demanded, her voice rising. Marcus, what is she talking about? But Marcus couldn't speak. He was staring at me with the same desperate expression he'd worn that night 3 years ago when he'd come to my apartment, begging for help. The same expression he'd worn when he'd signed over the deed to our childhood home as collateral for a loan he couldn't repay. The same expression he'd worn when he'd promised me he'd make it right. I think, I said calmly, setting down the wine glass, It's time we had an honest conversation about family and debts and what we owe each other. The room erupted into chaos, but I stood there in the center of it all, finally ready to tell the truth they'd all worked so hard to forget. What does she mean the house is in her name? Candace's voice had climbed to a pitch that could shatter glass. She was standing now, her face flushed red, looking back and forth between Marcus and me like we were some kind of puzzle she couldn't solve. Marcus, tell her she's wrong. Tell her she's confused. But Marcus couldn't tell her anything. He sat frozen in Dad's recliner, his mouth opening and closing without sound, looking exactly like the broken man who'd come to my apartment that desperate winter night. The rest of the family had gone silent, sensing drama, but not understanding its source. Uncle Robert had muted the television. Aunt Linda stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, a dish towel still clutched in her hands. The cousins were staring openly now, their earlier disinterest replaced by fascination. "I'm not confused, Candace," I said calmly. "When Marcus couldn't make his loan payments 3 years ago, he had to put up collateral. The business wasn't enough. He'd already mortgaged that to the hilt. So he signed over the deed to this house." "That's impossible," Candace sputtered. "This is our house. We live here. We've been living here for 6 years. You've been living here," I agreed. "But you haven't been paying for it." "Not really. See, when Marcus defaulted on that loan, when the bank was about to take everything, someone had to pay the debt. Someone had to write a check for $32,000 to keep this house from being foreclosed on." The number hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. I could see recognition dawning on several faces around the room. $32,000 wasn't pocket change in a small town like Millbrook. It was a life-changing amount of money. "Sarah," Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Please, let me explain." "Explain what?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Explain how you asked me to keep the loan secret so no one would know you needed help? Explain how you promised to pay me back, every penny with interest? Or explain how you've spent the last 3 years pretending it never happened while you rebuilt your life on my dime?" Candace was looking at Marcus now with something approaching horror. "You borrowed $32,000 from her? Your sister? And you never told me?" "I was going to pay her back," Marcus said desperately. "I always planned to pay her back. But business was slow for so long, and then when things started picking up, I thought." "You thought what?" I interrupted. "That I'd forgotten? That I didn't need the money? That maybe if you ignored it long enough, it would just disappear?" The silence stretched out, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. Tick, 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 marking the seconds of Marcus's shame, of Candace's dawning understanding, of my long overdue vindication. "Do you have any idea what I gave up for you?" I continued, my voice still calm, but with an edge now that cut through the room like a blade. "I was saving for a house of my own. A real place, not some cramped apartment with thin walls and broken appliances. I had plans, Marcus. I had dreams. And I gave them all to you because you were my brother and you needed help." "Sarah, I worked double shifts for months after that," I said, talking over his attempts at explanation. "I took a second job tutoring college kids on weekends. I ate ramen noodles for dinner more nights than I can count. All so I could survive after emptying my savings account for you. And what did you do? You bought a new truck. You took vacations. You sponsored charity events." Candace sank onto the couch, her face pale as paper. "Marcus, how could you not tell me? How could you let me think?" She stopped, her eyes widening as she realized what she'd been doing all evening. "Oh my God. I didn't give her any dinner. I told everyone she could buy her own food." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The woman who'd been questioning whether they had to feed me had been eating food paid for by the very money I'd never gotten back. "You want to know the really funny part?" I said, walking back to the mantelpiece and picking up that photo of Marcus at his business award ceremony. "This house was never supposed to be just yours anyway. Grandpa's will left it to both of us. But somehow, when the paperwork was filed, only your name ended up on the deed. Clerical error, you said. And I believed you." Marcus had his head in his hands now. Sarah, please. We can work this out. I can pay you back now. Business is good. I have the money. Now you have the money, I repeated. After 3 years of silence. After letting your wife treat me like garbage. After sitting there tonight and watching me be excluded from my own family dinner. I set the photo back down on the mantle. But here's the thing, Marcus. When I paid off your debt, the house transferred to me. Legally, officially, completely. I've been paying the property taxes on it for 3 years. Did you know that? Getting the bills forwarded to my address in Denver. The color drained completely from Candace's face. What are you saying? I walked over to where I dropped my purse by the door, pulling out my phone. I'm saying I've been thinking about selling this place. Real estate market's pretty good right now, and I could use the money. There's this little house in Denver I've had my eye on. Nothing fancy, but it would be mine. You can't, Candace whispered. This is our home. Our children. Your children? I asked. I wasn't aware you had any children, Candace. And as for this being your home, I shrugged. I think 3 years of free rent is generous enough, don't you? The room was completely silent now. Even the kids had stopped playing, sensing the adult drama unfolding around them. I picked up my overnight bag and slung it over my shoulder. I'll be in touch with a realtor this week, I said conversationally. Don't worry, I'll give you reasonable notice to find somewhere else to live. I'm not heartless. Sarah, wait. Marcus was on his feet now, reaching for me. Please, we can work this out. Family doesn't. Family? I stopped and looked back at him. You know what family does, Marcus? Family pays their debts. Family doesn't make each other eat dinner alone while everyone else enjoys a feast. Family doesn't pretend their sister doesn't exist for 3 years and then act surprised when she stops pretending back. I walked to the front door, my hand on the familiar brass handle. 600 miles I'd driven to get here, hoping for reconciliation, hoping for the family I'd never stopped missing. Instead, I'd found the truth. And the truth, painful as it was, had set me free. I'll send you the realtor's contact information, I said without turning around. You can deal with them directly about showings and inspections. Sarah, please. But I was already walking out the door, leaving behind the house that had never really been theirs, the family that had never really been mine, and the foolish hope that had brought me 600 miles for nothing. This time, when I drove away from Millbrook, it was with my dignity intact and my future finally my own.